with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Wednesday, November 16th, 2022. My name is Sam Seder. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Ari Berman, writer at Mother Jones Magazine, on Wisconsin as a laboratory for stealing democracy. Also on the program today, Aaron Kleinman, director of research for the States Project at Future Now, to give us a perspective on how this midterm election shook out on the state level. Meanwhile, still unclear who fired the missile, which landed in Poland, killing 2. Donald Trump declares his 2024 candidacy. This time, sans Ivanka.
And without the escalator, which...
No escalator.
Kinda... Gotta make up some space.
Weak tea. Weak tea. Federal judge halts the use of Title 42 at the border. And a Fulton County judge strikes down Georgia's abortion ban. They're going to have to pass a new one. Kevin McCarthy withstands a speaker challenge within his caucus, but a floor victory is going to cost him. Speaking about leadership challenge, Rick Scott challenging Mitch McConnell for Senate leadership. Whatever. Same-sex marriage bill gaining strength in the Senate. And the Biden administration seeking $38 billion for more Ukraine military aid. Another $10 billion on the COVID fight. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. Emma is out today, dealing with her move, as it is. Thanks for joining us. We got a lot to talk about today. Ari Berman's going to be here. Tell us how it all shook out in terms of things like redistricting and attempts to. Look, the Republican Party has a minoritarian, their strategy for maintaining power is a minoritarian one. I say that without any type of value judgment. It's simply the case. Their plan, and they made this decision within the past decade, it really does appear, maybe in the past 15 years, that they could either, following George Bush's attempt to expand the Republican Party via immigration reform, ultimately. I mean, that was
George W. Bush, who won with a minority.
George W. Bush, who won with a first time out, won with a minority of votes in this in the 2000 election, majority at the Supreme Court, as it were. But he and Karl Rove understood, from a demographic perspective, we need to make the Republican Party a little bit less white. And they attempted things like immigration reform and to have a lot less hostility towards Latinos and Hispanics. And that was rejected by the party at large. So at that point, Plan B became, how do we run the country in what is ostensibly a democracy with less votes. And we've seen it in 2010 was their big move in terms of gerrymandering. The Senate helps them out. In fact, the Senate was created as a buffer against full-on democracy in this country. The Supreme Court, there has been pretense for a long time, and at various times more or less, that it was above politics. Clearly it is not. And so that's where we're at this point. And so we'll check in with Ari about that. And then Aaron Kleinman, like I said, will give us an update on what appears to be a growing awareness amongst Democrats that, states are sort of important. Can't really ignore that. Meanwhile, back to the federal government, we still have no definitive answer as to who is going to control the House. More than likely, it's going to be the Republicans. They are one seat away. They are at 217 right now, officially speaking. They are one seat away from control. That would be 218, 435 members of the House. 218 is just one vote more than half. And there are 9 races extant. And the Democrats have 209, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? Yes. And so if the Democrats win all 9, then they will have a one-person lead. They're not going to. And so the question is, how big will the Republican majority be? The biggest it can be is 10. The smallest, theoretically, at this point, could be 1. But we will see. All right, let's get into this. There is a leadership fight in the Senate, and I think they're voting on it today. Is that right? Rick Scott, the former head, I don't know when that position ends, of the
hopefully soon
Republican Senate Campaign Committee, and Mitch McConnell, the Senate, or I should say minority leader in this instance, they're going to have a little struggle for who's going to be in charge of the Republican Party. If it was me, if I had to choose, I would choose Rick Scott.
Yeah,
because
perfect embodiment.
It's a perfect embodiment. He's also, I don't think he's terribly bright, and or at least not. I don't think he's as adept at this as McConnell is.
He doesn't hide the ball.
He doesn't. And here's Mitch McConnell addressing this leadership challenge.
One of the criticisms from Senator Scott and others who agree with him is that your decision not to have an agenda to run on opened up Republican candidates to attacks that they didn't really stand for anything. What is your response to the criticism that you are partially responsible for?
Every one of our candidates knew what they were for, expressed it quite clearly. It's pretty obvious, and all of you have been writing about it, what happened. We underperformed among independents and moderates because their impression of many of the people in our party in leadership roles is that they're involved in chaos, negativity, excessive attacks, and it frightened independent and moderate Republican voters. And we saw that, which is why you all recall I never predicted a red wave. We never saw that in any of our polling in the states that we were counting on to win. There was no wave. We had national issue set that was favorable, but as a result of our own, the perception many of them had that we were not dealing with issues in a responsible way and that we were spending too much time on negativity and attacks and chaos, they were frightened. And so they pulled back. We, in 2 states.
Pause it for 1 second. I just want to interrupt here because he is being so cautious in not upsetting the vast, like the strength of the Republican Party.
The chaos agents.
And let's be here. I mean, there's a couple of things to point out. Obviously, chaos is what they're associating with Trump. and that's what they're going to call it. Because ideologically, there is no daylight between Donald Trump and any of these other Republicans. There is none. It really is. I mean, the reason why he says chaos, because it really is presentation, period, end of story. There is no daylight between the idea that, like, we know what was the national issue they were running on. We know what it was. It was transphobia. I mean, if there is one consistent theme throughout this entire election, whether it was in Michigan where all their ads were about trans people and the threat from trans ideology and the idea that, women's sports will never be the same. And from Florida to Washington State, from Maine or New Hampshire with Bolduc down to, I don't know, to Carrie Lake. I mean, the one issue they had was transphobia. And I don't know. I'm sure that Donald Trump has been talking about it, but he's not leading this parade of he's definitely going to jump on it.
I'll dip my toe occasionally, but yeah.
But this is not, this did not come from Donald Trump. This did not come from Donald Trump at all. They were on this kick and developing it back during the Obama years with the trans bathroom supposed controversy.
You think Trump came up with critical race theory?
Exactly. No, but honestly, this is, I mean, to be fair, Trump did run explicitly on racism.
Right.
But to the extent that there was a national platform that the Republicans were running on, I would challenge anybody to show me the data that shows on dollar for dollar, word for word, that it wasn't transphobia they were running on. And so that had nothing to do with Donald Trump, but chaos. It's like, they're just not. And really, like, did Marco Rubio run any different campaign than Bolduc? Maybe he switched back and forth on the election a little bit more. Bolduc did, but give me a break. So this is all BS. It's just that they got bad candidates, people who were just full-on lunatics as opposed to ideological lunatics. That's what he means by chaos. They just didn't present well. I mean, Blake Masters just looks like a lunatic. Continue.
Attacks and chaos, they were frightened. And so they pulled back. We, in two states, for example, got just crushed by independent voters, Arizona and New Hampshire. So we learned some lessons about this, and I think the lesson's pretty clear. Senate races are different. I don't think so. Candidate quality, you recall I said in August, is important. And in most of our states, we met that test. In a few of them, we did not.
I mean, did they really meet that test? And where did they meet that state?
What does most mean?
Ron Johnson hung on in Wisconsin. I'm kind of trying to come up where they got those quality candidates to come in there. Florida Democratic Party is a disaster.
And what's funny is, like, I think the one that they kept running on, or at least advertising as the most quality candidate, was Adam Laxalt in Nevada, who in his own right in the state had a slew of his own, like, state-specific problems when he was Attorney General of Nevada. And he was the best one. He was the cream of the crop.
Was it J.D. Vance? I mean, J.D. Vance was outpaced by DeWine, right. 2-1 in terms of the margin of victory. So I don't know. I think the problem is that the National Republican Party has no reason to exist that doesn't involve either racism or transphobia or xenophobia.
Mike DeWine beat his Democratic opponent Nan Whaley by about 25%, and it was 6.5% for between Vance
Okay,
and Ryan.
so I stand corrected. He was outperformed by DeWine 4-1. I mean, the National Republican Party has none of that. Now, they're still going to be effective because you have some very, very conservative, transphobic, racist, xenophobic parts of this country that also want tax cuts. And there's a lot of money being expended for that. So that's where we're at.
McConnell's such a good politician where a question can be like, it said you didn't have like a message for this election. And all his responses, we know what the message was. It was the crazies that got in the way of the message.
Right, exactly. Exactly. Well, yeah, what was that message again? That would have been the follow-up. What was the message?
Right.
Can you just spell it out in bullet points?
Yeah. How about a bullet point? Like, just give us what was the Republican message in that instance? Now, to be fair, the Democratic message was a little bit muddled, but it was, we're just not those guys. And at the end of the day, that turned out to be far more palatable.
Republicans shouldn't think that they can win popularity contests.
Yeah. Well, I think they also, I think they know that. All right. Well, listen, we've got to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be talking to Ari Berman, writer at Mother Jones, author of Give Us the Ballot. Just a reminder, it is your support that makes this show possible. When you become a member at jointhemajority.report.com, not only do you allow this show to survive and thrive, you also get the free show, free of commercials, which I'm not going to lie, we're free of commercials today. So we have days like that. That's why we rely on our members. You guys make this possible, and thank you for that. JoinTheMajorityReport.com. Check it out. Don't forget also the AM Quickie. Right now, it's still free because I haven't got my act together yet, but I've been planning for about 14 months to charge a small fee for 5 days a week. We haven't quite figured that out, but amquickie.com. Get in there while it's free. Test it out. See if you like it. And justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority. Get 10% off of their coffees. Relevant, we're going to be talking about Wisconsin, and we're going to be talking about Scott Walker. And Just Coffee was out there back in those protests, 2010, 2011, giving out free coffee. They are movement partners and also great roasters of coffee. JustCoffee.coop. All right, right back after this with Ari Berman. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program. And it's been too long, frankly. Ari Berman, author of Give Us the Ballot and Herding Donkeys, and a writer at Mother Jones Magazine. Ari, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Sam. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you. You wrote a couple of days ago, democracy crisis averted, but gerrymandering could still save the GOP. Let's go back to the piece you wrote about Wisconsin and its being a laboratory for dismantling democracy. This goes all the way back to the election of Scott Walker. It goes back. This was a project by the Koch brothers and the AFP, Americans for Prosperity, if I remember correctly. Walk us through that.
Well, I think Wisconsin really has been the case study for how Republicans have undermined democracy at the state level, and then how they use the states to take over power at the national level as well, because you had basically a 50-50 swing state with a long progressive tradition. Republicans got control of it in 2010, like they got control of so many states in that election, and they worked very aggressively to entrench their own power by going after unions, by making it harder to vote, by changing campaign finance laws, and most crucially, by passing incredibly gerrymandered maps. That means that it would be impossible to vote them out of power. So I looked at both the 10-year strategy that's been deployed in Wisconsin very, very effectively, and then I also looked at how it would affect this election. And it's really remarkable if you look at the numbers. The governor, Tony Evers, a Democrat, won 51% of the vote. He won by 3.5 points in 2022, which is a landslide by Wisconsin standards. But Republicans got 67% of seats in the state Senate and 65% of seats in the state House. Basically, they came 2 assembly seats of getting a supermajority in the legislature, even though Democrats won 4 out of 5 statewide offices. So basically, they've created a system as far as legislative elections that's basically voter proof. And the reason why I said democracy crisis was averted was because so many of these election deniers lost. But the reason why I said gerrymandering saved the GOP is it's very clear that gerrymandering is what saved the Republican Party in Wisconsin, and likely also saved their majorities in other states, and could be the reason why they have a majority in the U.S. House when all is said and done.
Do we know how many votes were cast for state legislators, though? I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, maybe people just prefer Democrats on a statewide basis, but on a district by district basis, they prefer, Republicans. I mean, stranger things have happened. Do we know how many votes, like out of the votes cast? Because for a while, Wisconsin was one of those states, I think Pennsylvania had this dynamic too, where the vast majority of people voted for a Democrat, yet the vast majority, an even greater majority of elected state representatives were Republicans. Now, I've also heard that does not take into account the fact that you may have, through the gerrymandering, you may have districts that are less competitive for Democrats, so less or districts that are less competitive for Republicans, and so less come out maybe to vote. I'm not sure about that, but what about that apples to apples comparison of votes cast for state representatives and how that reflects the ultimate number that are in the state house?
We don't have that number for Wisconsin yet. We're not going to get it until next week because the counties are still bringing in their numbers. But in the past, there's been a very large dichotomy between votes and seats. So in 2018, for example, in Wisconsin, Democrats got 54% of statewide votes, but Republicans got 64% of seats in the legislature. Even when Republicans have managed to get a majority of votes in the legislature, they've got a much larger majority of seats in the body. So there's clearly a disconnect. I'm expecting the vote totals to be very close to 50-50 and nowhere close to being 65% of the assembly and 67% of the Senate. So I think it's very clear that there's just this huge disconnect between the political preferences of the state statewide and how the seats are being allocated to Republicans in the legislature. And it's also really interesting. You contrast Wisconsin with Michigan. Michigan's a place where politics was pretty much just as badly rigged in Michigan as it was in Wisconsin. But they passed fair maps after the 2020 census. There were a lot more competitive districts. And what happened in Michigan was Democrats were able to take back both houses of the legislature and regain control of state government for the first time since 1983. And that's just completely off the table in Wisconsin. So who knows what would happen if there was a fair fight in Wisconsin. But the only question in Wisconsin was, would Republicans get a supermajority? Whereas in Michigan and in other places where there are fair maps, the question was which party would get a majority. And I think that's a much healthier discussion for democracy.
And we should be clear that when you're talking about democracy, you're talking about the simple idea that if the majority of people vote in one way, it's reflected in who runs the government.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to look at Michigan, because when Michigan had Republican drawn maps and Gretchen Whitmer won by a very large margin in 2018, Republicans maintained a majority. But in 2022, she basically got the same number of votes as she did in 2018, but the legislature flipped because they were a fairer map. So it's a really good case study to look at. The conditions in Michigan in 2022 weren't that different from 2018. They honestly were worse for Democrats if you look at the political landscape. But Democrats were able to flip the chambers there because there were more competitive districts. So I think it's just a situation where you look at where the maps are fair, both sides get an opportunity to compete. And I think that's really what we should be looking for. Unfortunately, a lot of states were very, very rigged in terms of the maps. You look at, places where Republicans drew the maps, states like Texas, states like Georgia, states like Wisconsin, there was very little turnover at all in the legislature, very little turnover in terms of the U.S. House. So there was very little competition. So much of the competition was coming from states that had fairer maps, whether it was a place like California or a place like New York, although we can debate how fair the maps actually were there, but they were drawn by an independent person.
Before we move on to sort of the implications of Wisconsin Republicans not getting a supermajority and what they've done with that supermajority in the past in terms of like inhibiting the powers of the governor, where do we stand in terms of the long-term prospects of independent commissions? Because the Supreme Court, it feels like in their past decisions regarding gerrymandering, they are marching towards a situation where independent commissions will not be allowed, right? I mean, will you explain that dynamic?
Well, we'll see what happens. But basically, the Supreme Court's hearing a case next month, Moore versus Harper, where Republicans are arguing that state legislatures should have exclusive control over redistricting and also voting laws, in which case that would seem to outlaw the kind of independent commissions that exist in a lot of different states. It's interesting because the Supreme Court in 2019 said very explicitly that state courts should handle gerrymandering, and also that independent commissions were one response to gerrymandering. Now, 3 years later, they're turning around and looking like they're saying, no, only state legislatures should have the authority over this issue. So, I mean, that would be a seismic shift in terms of redistricting. Democrats did well in 2022 at the state level. They were able to flip a bunch of really important states.
Whoa! We got Aaron Kleinman coming on to talk about that next. So don't.
Okay, so I won't go too into it. But the point is, just very short, Republicans still control way more state legislatures than Democrats. So if the Supreme Court says state legislatures have exclusive control over how maps are drawn, how voting laws are done, then that benefits the Republicans more than the Democrats.
And we should be clear. I mean, I just want people to understand this distinction, right? There's a distinction between state government, which is the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, and a distinction between that and the idea of just the lawmakers, just the legislative branches. And the Supreme Court is leaning towards that notion of it being just the purview of the legislature, period, where state courts can't even respond based upon, I guess, even the context of their constitution, maybe, how voting takes place. And that legislatures are inhibited from having an independent commission, even if they decide that's what they want, because they don't have that power can't be delegated. It is so sort of like, I guess, it is such the purview and exclusive purview of the state legislative bodies. What changed over those 3 years, Ari?
What What changed was
from 2019.
The composition of the Supreme Court.
I'm joking.
I mean, it went from a 5-4 conservative majority to a 6-3 conservative majority. And so there would not have been 5 votes for this, I don't believe, in the 2019 court, because you still had John Roberts and you had Anthony Kennedy. So now you're talking about a shift in terms of who's on the court. Sorry, you had Roberts, you didn't have Kennedy at that point, but you had Ginsburg instead of Barrett. So that's the big shift here. And already we've seen 4 of the justices have already signaled their support for this theory. Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Thomas. So that basically leaves Barrett as the swing vote. Never really a good situation when Amy Coney Barrett is the swing vote. Is she even the swing voter, or has she just not said anything about this issue? But it's extremely radical to say that other parts of state government, like the governor, state constitutions, state courts, shouldn't have a say in state politics, that the legislature is the only body that should matter. And clearly Republicans brought this case because they know they've heavily gerrymandered the legislatures so much in Wisconsin that they want those bodies to be totally the last say. If the governor, for some reason, was heavily gerrymandered in all these states, they'd say the governor should have the authority. I mean, it's not based on any kind of principle. It's just that this is the place where their power right now is the most secure.
All right. So talk about the other response that once you get a supermajority within a Republican-controlled legislature, they respond by basically then saying, you know what, we've really thought about this, and maybe the governor doesn't have as much power as we thought they did.
The governor would have no power because
but I mean, walk through that in terms of like, but they have also. The first time that Evers got elected, they essentially said, we're pulling away various authorities from the governor that have existed in the past simply because that person is a Democrat.
Exactly. So in 2018, Tony Evers, who's a Democrat, defeated Scott Walker, which was a really big deal. Basically, days after Evers was elected, the legislature convened and stripped him of power, which had never been done in Wisconsin history before. They made it so it was harder to confirm members of his cabinet. They made it harder to vote by cutting early voting. They took away his ability to do different things administratively. So that really set the tone. And then throughout the next 4 years, the governor asked them to do popular things like expand Medicaid or have background checks for guns or a change in 1849 abortion ban that had no exceptions for rape or incest. And the legislature refused every time. And instead of basically taking power away from Tony Evers, they decided, let's just try to make him irrelevant altogether by gerrymandering the map so badly that we can get a supermajority, which means that we can override all of his vetoes. That would have been really consequential, not just because they would have taken power away from Evers, but I think the ultimate thing they wanted to do is Wisconsin has a bipartisan elections commission, and that's who runs elections, supervises elections, and also certifies non-presidential elections. The governor certifies presidential elections. So the legislature wanted to say, we're going to control how elections are run, and we're going to control how elections are certified. We're going to take away that power from the governor for presidential elections. We're going to take away that power from the commission for all other elections. Then that's like the ultimate big lie takeover of the voting system. Suddenly you have a legislature that's totally unaccountable because of gerrymandering, controlling the whole voting process. That's what was at stake with the supermajority. And the fact that Democrats stopped it is incredibly important, because it means that the certification of elections and the running of elections will continue how it was in the past, and makes it much harder for Republicans to try to steal the 2024 election, with the caveat of this big Supreme Court decision coming up.
And we should note that, if I'm not mistaken, in North Carolina, the legislature did the same thing when a Democrat was elected governor, sort of based upon that model that was developed in Wisconsin. Wisconsin really does seem to be the laboratory. I mean, I think
similar, and also North Carolina also barely just came short of getting a supermajority. So they're very similar, though I would argue that Wisconsin is more of a swing state probably when it comes to presidential elections. If you look at the last few elections, Wisconsin has been the tightest state and probably the most purple state there is. So but clearly it's not just Wisconsin. There's other states where if the Supreme Court was going to say that state legislatures have the full authority, that would really impact the next presidential election in a number of really key battlegrounds.
And we should say, though, there's nothing that is preventing this from being a problem in 2028, because this dynamic that exists in Wisconsin, let's say, to some extent in North Carolina, still in Pennsylvania on some level as well. Although, this dynamic means that this is a problem that's not going to go away unless there is a different Supreme Court that will have a different perspective on gerrymandering, right? I mean, is there any, how else does this go away from being a sort of, I don't know, biannual, whatever the word, perennial problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, we just got through 2022. Let's try to get through 2024 before we get to 2028. There was a real question of whether we were going to be able to have a fair election in 2024. And those odds are increasing. But I think basically, as long as legislatures control the drawing of districts, and also these states could flip in terms of trifectas, right? So like Wisconsin has divided government now, but there's no guarantee that they're going to have it forever. The only guarantee seems to be that Republicans will control the state legislature, because if you look at the places where they've had heavily gerrymandered control, they're still in control in all those places, except if the process by which the map's drawn had changed. So the only reason that there was a possibility of Democrats taking over in Michigan was because the maps changed. The political conditions were already there. And so it's hard to see how that happens in a place like Georgia or Texas or another state where there's heavy gerrymandering, absent independent redistricting becoming possible. And that would mean a very big shift in the dynamics of the state, because one of the things is, Michigan changed the process through a referendum. So statewide, they could change gerrymandering. That doesn't exist in Wisconsin. So it's very hard to figure out how to unwind this. Basically, the strategy that they have now, the Democrats have now, is there's a state Supreme Court election coming up in April. And if the Democrats win a majority on the court, even though they're technically nonpartisan, that would be a 4-3 progressive majority. Then they would probably file a new lawsuit against the gerrymandered maps, try to get the state courts to strike it down, and then get new maps that way, if the Supreme Court will even allow them to do that. So there's a plan
if
for how
the federal
to
Supreme Court will allow the state Supreme Court to adjudicate this question in their own state, is really
exactly. Yeah, basically, yes. I mean, right now they have the power to adjudicate it, but that looming over to the Supreme Court basically saying no, state legislatures have full control, which would basically give places like Wisconsin just zero recourse to try to challenge gerrymandering, which is a frightening thing.
So, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that. April is the date for this incredibly important state Supreme Court race. That has gone both ways in the past. These sort of like off-year, odd timing state Supreme Court races in Wisconsin, hugely consequential. Particularly, like you say, if the federal Supreme Court rules that the entirety of the state government has a say in these elections, as opposed to just the gerrymandered Republican lawmakers. Ari Berman, always a pleasure. Let's do this again soon.
Thanks so much, Sam. Appreciate you having me on.
All right, bye-bye. We'll put a link, incidentally, folks, to Ari's pieces at Mother Jones in the blog post, the YouTube, and the podcast descriptions. Now we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Aaron Kleinman will be here, and he is going to tell us specifically what states Democrats were able to flip in terms of state houses, which states Democrats were able to prevent from being supermajorities, where we have seen now the consequences of this, and basically whatever else he wants to tell us. We'll be right back after this. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Joining me and returning to the program, Aaron Kleinman, Director of Research for the States Project at Future Now. Aaron, it looks like you have not left your house, office, wherever it is that you are, in at least since probably a week before the election. So is someone bringing you food?
Listen, sleep. I feel like I can really catch up on sleep around sometime the middle of 2023.
Okay. All right, good. I'm happy for you. But it does look like you are, I get the sense, I can just imagine you're just in front of a wall of monitors, looking at counting, because it still continues, right?
Yeah. So in a number of states, most of the counting is done, but in Pennsylvania and New Hampshire, you have a bunch of recounts going on right now that will actually help determine control of who controls the legislature there. But if you look at the results we have in so far, by some pretty narrow margins, we nevertheless have flipped both chambers in the Michigan legislature, which means Michigan is a Democratic trifecta for the first time since 1983. We flipped the Senate in Minnesota and held the House, again, by narrow margins, like a couple hundred votes shift, and we don't have those. And now in Minnesota, you have a Democratic trifecta for the first time in a decade. In Pennsylvania and New Hampshire, as I mentioned, there are recounts right now. There's a chance that Democrats at least have a piece of power in both states, but in both states, people really thought, well, maybe they'll get there in 2024, 2022. They're just trying to, hold their ground. And so exceeding all of our dreams there. Nevada, we lost the governorship, but we increased our margins in the legislature. I could go on, Sam, but yeah, we've been having a good time.
That's what you're here for. I mean, this has got to be like, this has got to be, you got to be celebrating over there. This is what you do.
I'm celebrating by just looking at these numbers and smiling. In Arizona, we held our ground. We knew after redistricting really scrambled a lot of districts, and so we're like, if we can hold our ground in 2022. And so we're just one vote shy in both chambers, and now you have a Democratic governor in Arizona, so we can really kind of work toward maybe putting a stop to the worst excesses, and maybe we can work with some Republicans there. There are a few in Arizona who actually believe in democracy, so maybe there's a pathway there in Arizona. In Wisconsin,
we should say in Arizona, this is the first time in decades upon decades that the governor and the both senators are Democrats.
Yeah, since 1950. And I got a 3-year-old who he must be a Carrie Lake fan. I don't know.
Really upset about Arizona.
I'm sorry. You know what? We fell one seat shy in both chambers. He's sad about that. But we still held our ground there. And I'm trying to tell him every day, buddy, it's okay. We're just a seat shy. And really, in Arizona, we have a lot to build off of heading into 2024. That's what I tell him every night.
But that's no consolation. That's the thing I like about your kid. Just will not take anything short of a full victory.
He has
and
really
that's the
high
kind of spirit that we need. Yeah.
And then other states, in North Carolina, we actually prevented a supermajority there. You have a Democratic governor, some kind of unfriendly maps in the legislature, but by about 400 votes, I think we prevented a supermajority. And again, the person, Diamond St. Williams, who held that seat by about 400 votes, she was part of our Give Smart program. Again, our small donors really came through in some of the most important races here. So people really made a difference here. In Maine, we held our ground in both chambers. We actually, in a year where people were worried that Maine might flip Republican, where the RSLC, the Republican National Committee, put a lot of resources into trying to flip Maine, we held our ground in both chambers. Maine remains a trifecta, as it has been since 2018. New Hampshire, again, it's going to come down to there is a tied race. And the outcome of that,
we should say literally tied.
Literally a tied race, 970 votes each for a New Hampshire House seat. And the outcome of that, seems like it will determine which party is in the majority in the New Hampshire House.
What happens if it comes out 970 to 970?
So the state legislature would
send your
choose
son
the winner.
up there. What?
Yeah. The state legislature would choose the winner. And right now, because Republicans still hold the state Senate, they would have a majority. So it might end up being a Republican if it's still a tie, but it's kind of unprecedented what's going on there. And another thing to keep in mind with the New Hampshire House is you have 400 members there. It's the biggest legislature in the country other than the U.S. House of Representatives. On any given day, there's about 20 missing, and so it's kind of just chaos no matter what happens. So, yeah.
Sounds like they're meeting in your kitchen right now.
I think so. And then finally at Colorado, we kind of went in there late because they have the lowest contribution limits in the country, basically. And we helped win so many state Senate seats. They actually didn't have enough room in their caucus room, and now they're kind of assured of keeping the Senate more or less through 2026.
Wow.
Which is and by the way, so all of these great results, I want to keep in mind that us at the States Project, we were one of the biggest participants in all this. For example, in Arizona, we were the #1 contributor. We spent more than 30 times any other outside group. Pennsylvania House, the national groups kind of wrote it off. We were there. And, Minnesota, we were the largest funder on our side. Michigan, we were 8 times as big as any outside funder. So if, again, the real kind of, the people in the trenches, the people who actually ran for these seats and won and were able to persuade all the voters, hey, freedom's on the line here. Your freedom to choose, your freedom to choose your own representatives. This is all on the line. You got to vote for me. Those are the most important people here. But if you're coming from the outside and you're like, or if you care about the state legislature, wherever you are, and you want to make a difference, at the States Project, we really kind of have been able to make a huge impact there. And, again, check us out at statesproject.org if you want to kind of join in and help make a difference.
You didn't need to do that pitch. I mean, obviously that's why you're here, Aaron. I mean, we know, I mean, that is there, if there was an organization that it was as focused on this as you guys were, they would be here right now without their kid yelling in the background. But okay, was there places? I mean, this is it's incredibly consequential, both in terms of like the material differences in the state, what it's going to mean for the difference between not having a veto-proof majority for some of these Republicans in like a place like Wisconsin or in other places is North Carolina are big in terms of things like abortion bans, et cetera, et cetera. They are. It also has a big. It creates a bench for down the road for Democratic politicians, which we have been sorely lacking because of the 1,000 seats that were lost during the Obama years. It also impacts the narrative that is at least causing disarray amongst Republicans, for the time being. Were there states where we lost, where like that there was a material difference in terms of like, did we lose a trifecta, or did the Republicans gain a trifecta?
The only state where we lost the trifecta was Nevada, and that's because we lost the gubernatorial election there, but we actually gained seats in the legislature. So that was kind of the incumbent governor there. I think Nevada, more than any other state, was impacted by kind of COVID-19 mitigation. And so that really just became very hard. It was kind of there was that. And then also the Republican candidate there ran just a better campaign than most other Republicans across the country. And there was the confluence of those two factors. Things are still a bit unsettled in Alaska. Because basically in Alaska, they have the ranked choice voting. And so we won't know for, I guess, another week who actually is elected. And then after the election in Alaska, typically you have kind of these shifting coalitions that don't break neatly on partisan lines that end up kind of deciding who controls the legislature. So Alaska's up in the air. But other than that, Democrats retain power, any power that they did have across the country.
That's huge. What are the implications for 2024 in this regard? Like, I know that, for instance, the Senate map looks the federal Senate looks tough for Democrats. It's been a while since I took a look at it, but there are, as far as I know, you don't have any Republicans that are up in like a purple state for re-election, and you got plenty for Democrats. What does it look like? I mean, but that doesn't implicate at all like state houses, right? I mean, we're
right.
Okay.
Yeah. So the biggest thing really is we were able to flip Michigan and Minnesota Senate. So we have those now through, absent like a special election loss or something like that. We have, we're in control there through 2026. Pretty much everywhere else I mentioned, they'll be up again. Or I guess in the Nevada Senate has like staggered terms, but pretty much everywhere else they'll be up again in 2024. But the big impact on 2024, and something that the reason why we really poured so many resources into these races and why people are so responsive to that, is there was a real risk that state legislatures would try to steal the 2024 election. And if you look at 2020, again, you had Rusty Bowers go before the January 6th Commission. He's the former Arizona House Speaker. And he said, the Trump people came to me and they were like, you need to give us like 12,000 more votes in the state, have the legislature overturn the election results. And what Bowers told them was that I don't have a legal basis for doing that. Now, one thing that could change between then and the 2024 kind of post-election period is in a couple of weeks, the Supreme Court is going to hear a case called Moore v. Harper.
Right.
And in that case, the Supreme Court may decide that state legislatures have the sole ability to determine basically the outcomes of federal elections. It's a very scary case. Hopefully, the fact that kind of, we showed everyone, by the way, Democrats can win state legislative seats too. Hopefully, a very partisan Supreme Court will decide, hey, maybe this is really playing with fire. We should back down. But it's still a real risk. And so if we kind of went into 2024 where Republicans had these majorities in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and, and had bigger majorities in Arizona, because again, we think there are some pro-democracy Republicans we can work with there. If they'd had those big majorities, there would be a real risk for state legislatures basically nullifying the results of the 2024 election. And after these elections, we really kind of there's a big blow toward that risk. I think that's just a lot less likely now. And that really is a credit to kind of the work that we at the States Project did, but also, our donor communities who really came through for this election, Give Smart, our Giving Circles. These people poured resources into the races that really made a difference in chamber control in these states that really are going to help save democracy. Races that were literally decided, a few hundred votes had switched in a few different places.
New Hampshire could rest on one vote.
Yes. Yeah. Like the margins in these races are just so astronomically small. The average state legislative
More people
campaign
voted for me as vice president of my high school senior class than are going to be deciding that race in the control of the New Hampshire State House. That's nuts.
It is.
I mean,
really
my race was not close. I'm here to tell you. I mean, it was a while ago, but that's nuts. I mean, so people should vote. I mean, because the amount of time that would be invested in that what is it, 1941st vote, I guess, right? It was 970. Did you say?
Yeah, 970. So yeah, the 1,941st vote. If you live in
that would have
the fourth
been
ward of Rochester, New Hampshire,
they would have decided control. We'll see how the recount goes, but they would have decided control of the New Hampshire State House. All right, so you're going to take a nap sometime like in May of 2023. Yeah. When you wake up from that nap, what are you going to focus on?
So heading into, the work doesn't stop. Like I said, in 2024, I think New Hampshire and Pennsylvania really will be critical because lawmakers there can take office in December. And so if there's any post-election shenanigans, we want to be sure that won't happen. But yeah, I mean, even kind of coming up in 2 months, there is a special election for the Virginia Senate that could really help protect choice in the Commonwealth of Virginia. in April, there's going to be a Wisconsin Supreme Court election. That
I was going to ask you, do you guys get involved? Do you guys get involved in those Supreme Court elections?
No, that's not part of what we do now, but obviously it's really important for state legislatures. So at the very least, kind of letting everyone on your show know that there's this really important election coming up in Wisconsin. It's like the least we can do. And then in 2023, the full chambers in the Virginia legislature are going to be up. You have a fleece-wearing guy who pretends he's a moderate, but then goes around with Carrie Lake trying to run that state. And I think the people should show him, hey, maybe you should focus on the Commonwealth of Virginia instead of your presidential ambitions. And so heading into 2023, that's going to be a big one too. So, the work never stops. But at the same time, again, we're all really happy about what happened. And again, the margins in these races are so close. The amount of money spent is so much less. These races cost about 3% what a U.S. Senate race costs. So everyone who got involved in this, it's not just, I'm just one guy, but everyone who kind of came out and was willing to stand with us as a group to say, hey, these elections matter. Democracy matters. The right to choose matters. Everyone who stood together and did that, again, everyone gets, take your own little victory lap there, because you really help make a difference in just, again, so close races. So close.
Aaron Kleinman, Director of Research for the States Project of Future Now. We're going to put a link to both Future Now and States Project in our podcast, our YouTube description. Thank you for the work you did. Congratulations. It couldn't really, it's hard for it to imagine for it coming out better. I mean, I feel like if 6 months ago I said, give me your best case scenario, you guys sort of like surpassed it.
We did. Sam, you and I have actually talked about what I think really was the main animating thing in this election before, a lot of negative partisanship. And the reason why I thought, when a lot of people were saying, hey, I don't know if you're going to have a chance in Michigan, you're going to lose ground in Arizona, you don't have a chance in Minnesota. And I'm like, hey. These are very evenly divided states, and they have maps that either party can win on. And what you really have is negative partisanship plays such a key role. And what you need to do now is you need to kind of just go out there and get the resources to your candidates so they can go out and say, hey, this really, my opponent really stands for some incredibly extreme right-wing things. They will vote for some incredibly extreme right-wing things in their state legislature. And because we were able to help them do that, because we were able also to help them get, or really encourage them to get into their local news, because local news is the most trusted news source for pretty much everyone. I know we kind of think it's all Facebook groups and crazy stuff right now, but like getting a story in your local paper, getting a story in your local TV station is still huge. Getting them to knock on doors, which is something that we really couldn't do in 2020 because of the pandemic. And then just kind of helping them get the staff that they need. Those are kind of the 4 pillars of our strategy. And just being able to go out there and get them those things. We knew that in an environment that was as polarized as ours is now, where really so many people have such strong feelings against the Republican Party and just kind of need to be activated, and people who kind of feel kind of negative against both parties, we really did have a story to tell about. You may not think that the National Democratic Party is all that great, but we need to tell you all the extreme things that this opponent stands for and all the good things that we stand for. If we could just get that message out, we knew that we had a chance in these states, and that's why we were there, and that's why we ended up succeeding, even though the margins were just so incredibly slim.
Yeah, amazing. Well, Aaron Kleinman, again, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam.
All right, now go punish that child.
I'm
joking. Not really. He will punish that child. He will do it now. I assure you. He's going to that child.
By making him do some tabulations.
Exactly. That kid is so upset about what's gone on in Arizona and New Hampshire. Heavily invested in that. Folks, that signals the end of our free half of our program. We're going to head into the famous fun half of the show. If you go and pick up the app at majorityapp.com, we have both the free iOS and the free Android. Not only will you be able to IM the show, if you're a member, you'll be able to call into the show. The new app I'm not sure exactly when we're rolling it out. Like we're testing it out now. We're doing QC. We're doing IU. We're doing all of it. It looks great. This is a new iOS app. The Android app is going to follow after that. Really is about, the hard thing is to design it in a way that is logical and intuitive and simple and easy and functional. And then you code that baby up. No problem for me whatsoever. Once I figure out, I can't do any of that. It's all Kyle. But the app looks great. And, it's going to become, I think for us, like in many ways, a hub. So easy to use, so easy to listen to the show, great audio, great video. It's all of that. So check it out, majorityapp.com. Also, again, it's your support that makes this show possible. You want to help us survive and thrive, join the majorityreport.com. Emma's out today. Tomorrow, ESVN. What do you guys do on the overtime, Bradley?
We're going to...
Okay, use the microphone.
Sorry.
No mics on that show.
I was eating breakfast. We are going to do our picks for Week 11, our best bets for the incoming NFL action. And we'll probably just do a little bit of some NHL and NBA news and roundups from the week that it was as well. And I believe, I think we've talked about this, but I think Matt will be joining us next Monday for a bit more NBA coverage.
Total
basketball
stuff.
Do some now that the Left Reckoning Emma crossover is done, we now have to bring Matt to an away game.
Matt, speaking of Matt, and somebody wrote that you understand why you're a little bit hostile to the whole MCU thing. What is happening in Matt's world? I don't like that either.
Last night, well, it's not much of a universe because Left Reckoning is a little bit on ice, but we had
Left Reckoning's on ice,
or literary hangovers.
Literary hangovers on ice.
But I am hopefully going to try to animate that in a little bit. But last night, Left Reckoning, we had Nick Marcel on to talk about the from the Debt Collective to talk about Joe Biden's student loan thing, and his main point was Biden should just cancel it all now. Under
the other authority.
Yeah. And because this is what happens. And also we talked with I'm blanking, Ryan Zickraff of who wrote a Jacobin piece about about a labor struggle in Tennessee that was uncovered. So check out that, patreon.com/Left Reckoning. We talk about Trump's announcement in the postgame.
646-257-3920 is the number. We will also talk about Donald Trump's announcement. Spoiler alert, he's running for president again.
Yep.
But it really raises some real question what's going on with the whole Tiffany Ivanka race. We will talk about that.
I overlooked that.
Yep. Mm-hmm. We'll be right back after this.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun.
Oh,
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Anarchy. Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just want to degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflakes has what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.